Look, it's wonderful to be here. Can you hear me in the back all right? Yes. We used to be in these rooms a lot when we did the board meetings for ADC, so this is all very familiar. In fact, we actually did the strategy day here, and it was middle of summer, and we're spilling out over to the courtyard because it's so hot. I was given a very difficult topic today. It was not just to talk about what's happening in New Zealand, but what are the kind of policy choices that lead to the inequality that we see today. And I was scratching my head. I was scratching my head because is it the policies that lead to inequality, or is it the intent of society that's expressed in politics that leads to those policies? Very hard to disentangle those two things. And I'll offer some theories, I'll offer some views, but I'm going to tell you I don't know the answers for sure. So it's very much a journey for me in terms of understanding this particular issue. So before I get started, as David said, I'm the chief economist at Simplicity, but today I'm not giving you financial advice. But if you want to invest any money in Simplicity, you can. That'll be absolutely fine. Very welcome, especially after Sam's recent foray into social media that was not so good. But there's a few things that I want to, I guess, get across today. The first is really around, I guess, looking at this room, most of you will remember the reforms of the 1980s. And so much of their promise was, if we just do this, everything will get better. But it's not working. It has made some things better. It has made some people better. But I think we can agree there's a whole bunch of different issues around society that haven't gotten better. I was talking to Pam before in the outside, and we're just chatting about just the expansion of poverty that we have seen in New Zealand, particularly in the last decade. That to me is shocking. I hadn't seen this level of hunger in New Zealand in the way that we see today. I did a piece of work on social cohesion earlier this year, and we found that a quarter of New Zealanders go hungry sometimes or often because of a lack of money. A country that prides itself on growing food, on feeding the world is apparently our ambition, and yet we cannot feed our own people. Something is distressingly wrong when that is the case. But I think part of the reason why this is the case is there is a failure of imagination, that we are failing to imagine a New Zealand that is fair, that is more equitable, and we're lifting people up out of poverty. There is a zero-sum thinking that has taken hold, particularly amongst our rich people, who think that they will become poor if we look after the poor in New Zealand, that any gain to them is a loss to me. I don't know where this thinking has come from. Something has shifted in our DNA that's gone from that more egalitarian narrative that we have told ourselves for a very long time in New Zealand's history to something more recent that has essentially said, actually, it's I alone. My success is due only to me, and the future success of New Zealand will only be on the back of individuals. There's also an element of, I think, a lack of understanding. And what I mean by that is the way we talk about the economy, the thing, as if it's this scientific thing that happens out there, rather than an economy just being us interacting with each other. And this disassociation of society from the economy, I think, has been particularly problematic. And it's actually not true that in some way the economy is disconnected from society. Of course it's not. I mean, that's the bloody point. Right? The whole point of economics is to study the interaction of people, part of it which happens to be money, but it's not the only thing. So I think there is actually a level of ignorance that has become very entrenched that is quite problematic. When I kind of think about where we are in New Zealand, and when I go around the country, and I go around the country a hell of a lot in New Zealand, and that's actually the most enjoyable part of what I do, what I also see is not just the kind of the hunger, the poverty, that's absolutely true, but I also see New Zealanders around the country who really care and want to do things differently. So there's also reason for us to have hope. I think we can do better, but it's not going to happen by doing more of the same. It requires some kind of trade-off. We have to make some kind of investment. We need to make some kind of circuit breaker to be able to go from where we are to where we want to be. The difficulty that I find when I meet all these worthies around the country is they want something better, but they want nothing to discomfort them. I must remain exactly as comfortable as I am today, and I want the future to be better. Maybe we need to do something differently. Maybe at least some things need to shift. And the last thing that I'll kind of touch on right towards the end is around what we, I think, can do, including in institutions like this. And I think there are three broad themes that I really want to kind of get across. The first is around, in what we do, I think we have to give people meaning. I think that's one of the things that we're really struggling for in social life and private life in New Zealand and around the world. We are becoming more lonely, we're becoming more disconnected, and we're finding it difficult to find meaning in ourselves and in what we do. The second thing is around the idea that institutions like this and gatherings like this should provide a means for us to coordinate. And what I mean by that is for us to be able to work together. Because that working together part, that participation, just seeing that there are other people who also care, can be a really uplifting experience. And the final thing, which I think is the fundamental failure in terms of why our policies are not dealing with the issues that we see today, is we are failing to have collective action. And I was speaking to a bunch of union people yesterday. So this was all the school teachers who are about to go on strike. They gave me this pounamu because they thought I did a good job. No pressure. And what was really fascinating was, of course, unions are all about collective action, but even unions are struggling, right? Union membership in New Zealand has been trending down for a long time, and a lot of that was very deliberate about trying to kind of break that, that representation and that very formal kind of alternative to the political powers that we see through political parties. And so there is this element of collective action that's really important, and it doesn't need to be political per se, but I think everything is inherently political, right? Whether it's bottom-up or top-down, it's political one way or the other. How we express our views, what we want, and how we want them actually matters a great deal. So this might seem a little bit esoteric, but I think it's an important kind of starting point of the things I want to talk about. So when the big pitch was around talking about inequality, I guess I was like, oh, that's a big topic, right? I could speak for hours on this issue. And there's a few things I just want to get across just in terms of definitions, in terms of what we think about and where I'll focus today. The first one is around the types of inequality, and both of these matter. One is the kind of the absolute inequality, and quite often what we're talking about is essentially the poverty that exists in society. There is a portion of society that are doing it really, really tough. So there is an absolute level of inequality. And then there's the relative inequality, which leads to people not having access to enough opportunities to be able to make the most of themselves. And both of these things matter. Some of it can be good, and some of it can be really bad. And this inequality can be seen across both income and in wealth. And both of these things matter, right? And quite often we don't measure these things very well. Particularly in New Zealand, our data is fairly sketchy. We just make stuff up. It's quite, there is a lot of that. Which makes it very difficult for us to have these conversations because you don't have the evidence. It's really then difficult to go, actually, there's a really big problem we need to solve. Instead, what I find is I'm bickering with my fellow economists about whether the definition of the data is right, whether it's the artifact of the data or the poverty truly exists. And my kind of point is, go to Wairoa and go to the backcountry and see if people are living in poverty or not. But these people don't go to Wairoa, right? They live in the comforts of their lovely suburbs in Wellington and never go out. There's also an inequality that's not just about income and wealth, but also where it's expressed. It's both between and within communities. And I think that's really important to understand that quite often these disparities that we see are not always kind of that one group that's over there, that's marginalized and is out of sight, but quite often it can be in our midst. And so this is about that inequality between and within communities, within regions, and between ethnicities and generations. And the last one is particularly important because that's the one that I think I'm seeing the most expressed in the fragmentation of social cohesion. The biggest increase in loneliness is a barbell. It's old people and young people. Old people I understand because most of your friends have died off. But for young people, they're just disconnected, disengaged. And that is really frightening because they're going to have another 60, 70 years of living with this loneliness that's only going to intensify. And it scares the hell out of me. How are we going to have a society that's able to come together and fix our big issues if they're so lonely and so disconnected and so disengaged? And I worry about that. But also, we should not think about these things in black and white. And I think this is one of the things that I learned in economics. I was talking to one of my lecturers from Lincoln University, Paul Dalziel. I don't know if any of you read his work. Paul does a huge amount of work in well-being economics, and he's like a hero of mine. And he was saying, Shamubeel, one of the biggest things you need to understand about economics is that it's all shades of gray. It's not black and white. There can be good and bad at anything, and you need to be able to see both of those things and hold that complexity in your head. And I think that's also to do with inequality. A little bit of inequality is not necessarily a bad thing. Quite often that can be the drive and the reason behind innovation, why people take risks, why people study hard, why people do anything, right? It's okay to have a little bit of tension in society. It's normal. What's not normal to have these huge disparities and where we force people to stay in poverty. That's problematic. So in the good is there's incentives that we can see in inequality, but the bad is also what we know is that when you're living in poverty, you have fewer opportunities. That we also know that rise in inequality, particularly when it disperses too much, we also see it spilling over into other things. It's no surprise that New Zealand's prison population has increased since the 1980s. It was not an accident, right? What happens when you take away the safety nets? What happens when you take away some of those bits of social glue that help people to connect with each other? Well, you get that disruption in society. So it's not always a direct link, but those correlations are extremely strong both in New Zealand and around the world. And so we should not assume that the conflict that we see in New Zealand today, that erosion of trust in politics and institutions, these are not products of nothing. They didn't magically appear. It's a consequence of decisions that we have made and consequence of the state that we find our society. So as an economist, I like a lot of charts. You might have noticed that. But it's because I want to kind of illustrate some of the pictures so that you can kind of grasp why we're kind of thinking about this stuff so much. But also that we quite often, when we look at one thing, we miss the other. So on the left-hand side is an issue that we talk a lot about, how New Zealand's falling behind Australia, right? And that shows you the New Zealand's average kind of GDP per capita, kind of proxy of average prosperity. And you can see that pretty much until about 40 years ago, we were very similar between the two countries. And then things diverged, and they diverged a lot. And it has been a persistent trend. Do you remember when John Key was the Prime Minister and he said, we're going to catch up with Australia by 2025? Whoops. Good intent, right? Good intent. We had lots of working groups and they came up with lots of reports. We made no changes, didn't adopt those policies. Whether you agreed with them or not doesn't matter. The problem was we do a lot of this navel gazing and then keep on doing more of the same. And then we're really surprised that nothing has changed. But when I look at averages also, what we find is that you miss a lot of who benefits from that increase in prosperity. And the picture on the right-hand side shows you New Zealand's income inequality. It's not a perfect measure, but it just shows you what the kind of broad trends were. We had pretty high inequality in New Zealand. This is income inequality. Pre the building of the welfare state. Can you see that? Pre the Second World War, we had pretty high income inequality. And then we built the welfare state and it worked. The whole purpose of it was to kind of lift up people from the bottom, and we did. And the middle became much more comfortable, and generally speaking, income inequality remained relatively low. You can see this little spike up here. That's when we had that wool bust, and that had a really big impact on the New Zealand economy. And then you can also see the big rise that we saw with the reforms of the 1980s. And that was really deliberate, right? We're going to take away those safety nets because they're holding back New Zealand, not enough incentives for people to do things. And because of this big suite of reforms, everything will be better. And after this initial increase in inequality, it will fall back and everything will be better. That was the promise and that was the hope. But as you can see, that did not actually happen. The only reason we saw this really big drop in inequality was in the middle of COVID when we gave people money. And then it bounced back up. So the reality of New Zealand's inequality is that while we have made some progress in recent years, the overall structural story is we had relatively low income inequality when the welfare state was in place, and then it rose when it was not in place. So the solution to having less inequality is not that difficult. We actually have the history to tell us what to do. The reason why I think why this has become so hard is because we are not doing economic policy and public policy with a social lens. We do public policy now with an economic lens. And that's a really big problem. People like me are part of the problem. The problem is when we describe the economy, quite often we talk about it in terms of jobs and the investment and the infrastructure, right? The capital, labor, and the technology. It sounds very scientific, but really it's made up, right? It's just a figment. It literally is a bunch of people working together to create something good. That's all an economy is. And so what we do is we kind of really try and complicate things, and we describe it in terms of human capital, natural capital, social capital, physical capital, innovation, creativity. Fine, all of those things are fine. But the problem is because some things are easy to measure, we only look at those things. Because natural capital is hard to measure. Well, hard to measure, can't be that bad, can it? Maybe it can. Social capital, well, that's really hard to measure. Surely it's not that important. So when we have the conversations about the economy, we don't talk about social capital and natural capital. We talk about jobs, we talk about GDP, we talk about what's going on in terms of productivity, but we lose sight of those underlying things that are actually the fundamental building blocks of the economy. But also it misses the point in terms of what causes prosperity. So the reason why we measure the economy is not because the economy in and of itself is important. The reason why we want an economy is so then people can have prosperity. However that's defined, right? We want people to have comforts. We want to have their basic needs met. We want them to be able to unleash their hopes and dreams. That's really what this economy is about, right? We want people to fulfill their potential to the best of their ability, or with support. So when we look at the fundamental source of prosperity, and this was quite a lot of the Nobel Prize in economics just went to a guy called Acemoglu and Robinson, and all their work was around not in terms of how to describe the economy, but what causes differences in prosperity across different countries. Why is it that some places are doing better than others, right? And I don't know, some of you might have heard of the book, Why Nations Fail, and a lot of that theory is behind that. And now, none of this stuff is perfect, but their theory is there are three kind of fundamental things. Actually, there's four. One of them is luck. We can't replicate that, so I just left that one out. But if you can pray for some luck, I'll happily ask for that. But the other three things is geography, culture, and institutions. And so geography is really around not just where we are physically, but our size, our economic kind of resource. New Zealand's actually fairly blessed in some ways, right? Even though we're small in the middle of nowhere, we're an enormous country. And I think a lot of people forget that, right? We're a big country, so we have a lot of land mass, we have a lot of water, we're not too far from our enemy, we're quite far from our enemies. You know, unlike the Europeans, you draw a 2,000 kilometer around Berlin, you've got everybody, including Putin, right? 2,000 kilometers around us, holiday in Fiji. So, things are, relatively speaking, much better in that sense. But when it comes to that distance, it's also becoming less, right? Because the world is becoming more Asian, the center of global trade is coming towards us, all that kind of stuff. So distance is less of an issue than it used to be. So we're not exactly stuck. We actually have some strengths. But the things that I really want to talk about today are those two things around culture and institutions. So when it comes to the fundamental drivers of prosperity, the theory goes, it's really culture that matters, and that's what people think, what people value, and what people are able to come together to do. And the institutions are the norms in society, the rules, regulations, and all those things, right? So the whole gamut from everything from the formal to the informal. But it's those institutions are in fact reflections of culture. Institutions don't exist in isolation. They're in fact a reflection of what we want as society. Through the power of politics, through the power of participation, whatever it might be. But that is fundamentally where that prosperity comes from. And that's a really hard one for people to swallow, right? Because essentially what we're saying is that if there is something wrong in a society, quite often it's because there is something gone wrong with our culture and the institutions that they reflect. When I see, how many of you are news junkies? Most of you, some of you. I've stopped reading the news lately. I find it really depressing. It's only because it's such a barrage of headlines. It's really hard to keep up, right? And what I've noticed is, whether it's Brexit, quite a while ago now, the rise of the far right in Europe, Trump and Trump again, these are quite distressing kind of scenarios, because what we're seeing is what we thought was normal, what we thought was acceptable is no longer true, which is an extraordinary position to be in. And sometimes it feels like this is something very recent and it's inexplicable. How could it possibly have happened? Surely we don't want a return to bad old days. And yet, I'm going to tell you that I think it was quite predictable that we would see this outpouring of discontent in politics. When I look around the world, what I see is the rise of polarization for the last 30 to 40 years, pretty much in sync with that increase in inequality that we saw post the reforms of the 1980s. And so the picture on the left-hand side on that orange line is the share of countries that are polarized politically. And what you can see, it's pretty much rising from the 1990s onwards. And again, it's not surprising that that's taking place, because what we saw over that period was very rapid pace of globalization in particular. And that globalization led to a huge uplifting of people from poverty from the global south. But we saw an increase in inequality in advanced economies. Rich countries all of a sudden found that global inequality is falling, but inequality within our own countries and communities is increasing. It's not acceptable to people to have that happen. And this discontent, I think, is exactly what's behind what's happened with Brexit, what's happened with far right, what's happened with Trump. These are all expressions of the discontent that has been building and are now boiling over into the public sphere. New Zealand is not immune from that. So the picture on the right-hand side is the net number of New Zealanders that are saying that New Zealand's heading in the right direction. And essentially, generally speaking, we're heading in the right direction. New Zealanders are pretty accepting kind of people. We're happy to accept things as they are, and we're generally quite upbeat. So generally speaking, about half of us think we're heading in the right direction, except in periods of economic recessions, which is quite normal. So you can see that around that left-hand side, that was around the GFC, that was pretty painful, right? And then you look at the right-hand side, and that's the first term of Jacinda's regime was essentially, thank God you've kept us alive. The second term of Jacinda's regime was, can you stop locking us up? And then we kicked them out and said, we'll get some new lot in. And then we were like, I don't like this lot either. And it's not so much about who's in charge at the moment. I think there is a more fundamental discontent with politics by New Zealanders. And that's a much more difficult diagnosis than pointing to individuals or party politics that's leading to the discontent. And why I say that is because when I look at who's saying that the country is heading in the wrong direction, it's not one stripe of political group that's saying that. It's a broad range of New Zealanders who are saying that from across different political persuasions. And that is very unusual, because we tend to be quite ideological, quite parochial in who we support. And we see that in the US at the moment, for example. So in the US right now, the Democrats think there is lots of inflation, and the Republicans think there is no inflation, right? Their vision of reality is dictated by who's in power. In New Zealand, not yet that, right? But so I think this is really important just to get a sense of the backdrop, is we're in this very strange place at the moment. And when you're in this strange place, it's really hard for politicians to make those trade-offs. So what our politicians are doing now is saying, look, our public don't really like us. Even our supporters don't like us, right? What are we going to do? Let's offer them some unicorns. Everybody likes unicorns. Let's promise them some unicorns. And what I mean by unicorns is when you're choosing things, whatever they are, public policy, projects, infrastructure, whatever, you have to choose 2 out of 3 things between good, fast, and cheap. You can't have all 3. You can only have 2. So your project is either going to be expensive or slow or terrible. Which one are you going to offer? Nobody wants expensive, don't want to pay any taxes. Nobody wants slow because I'll be out of government by the time it happens. And it can't be terrible because nobody's going to buy that. And so our politicians are increasingly trying to offer up these impossible dreams that we're going to cut your taxes, we're going to cut debt, and you're going to have better services, more services, and everything is going to be kumbaya. And it's a really challenging thing, because what we're finding is the public don't buy it. The public can see through it. They can see you can't do both of those things. You can't do all 3 of those things. In fact, not only both, you can't do all of those things that you're saying that you would do. And I think therein lies the rub at the moment, is our politicians are backed into a corner and they're telling us that they're going to do all these things that they're not capable of delivering. And the less they execute, the less we trust them. And so the politics, in my view, is going to become quite challenging over the course of the coming years. It already is, and I think it will become more so. I think what we're going to find is we're going to get governments that come in and they're just going to try a barrage of things, as they're doing at the moment. Every day there is a new policy that's being announced. It's just get as much as you can get done in those 3 years that you're going to be there, just in case you don't get back in. It doesn't matter how unorthodox, just get it done, put it in. It doesn't matter if things break along the way. You don't have to pick up the pieces. There is no sense of responsibility. It's just get it done. Execute your political priorities as quickly as possible. As a result, what we're finding, our public institutions are under attack. Our public service is being hollowed out. What we're finding is that evidence, free and frank advice, is no longer desired. But this is not new. This has been happening for a long time. I saw this happen when Cullen was the finance minister. So this is not as if it's one type of political party that's doing it. This attack on our public institutions has been happening for a while. And this slow erosion is now coming to a stage where we now, I get to, as part of my work, I get to review regulatory impact statements. It's wonderful when you're a nerd like me. But what's shocking is the loss of quality in these regulatory impact statements. It's gone from going, here is a big policy, here is how we think you should be doing it, here's what you've proposed, here are the strengths and weaknesses. It used to be fairly balanced. No longer the case. They read more like political manifestos now, rather than true regulatory assessments. So there is a real problem there. And I think these problems are only going to intensify because those fiscal pressures are getting much worse. I'll show you a picture on that later. But also I think there is no center. Our political kind of partisanship is becoming more fractured. That's why we're seeing those minor parties becoming so much bigger, whether it's New Zealand First or ACT or the Maori Party or Greens. And none of these things are good or bad. It just is that those major parties are becoming smaller. As a result, they're unable to hold the center. But politicians are not the problem. They're a reflection of society. I think it's very easy to point the finger and go, it's because of Winston, right? I like to blame Winston for a lot of things. But the thing is, he represents a group of society, and increasingly a larger group of society. And that's what democracy is about. And what we're seeing is that center has really fractured, and we've got a much bigger group of people that need representation. And a lot of the conversations in politics is about zero-sum thinking. That we will do it in this way because I can only make this group better off if that group is made worse off. And that's a really troubling place for us to be in because I don't think that was the case when we built the welfare state. The idea was that we will make this investment and there will be a payoff to the wider society and future generations. There was a very strong belief that that would happen, and I don't think that's true anymore. And so this is where we find ourselves today. And I know I'm taking quite a long time to get to the policy bit that you guys want to hear about, but I think this is really important context because policies don't exist in vacuum. They exist because we as society want them and we're able to hold those views. When you look at where our trust is in key institutions, only 1/3 of us trust media. Less than half of us trust government. That's the only thing you really need to look at. Because if those two key institutions are no longer trusted, it's really hard for us to find broad consensus because we become so fragmented from each other. Because we don't interact in our communities as much as we used to. We don't go to church, we don't go to sports, we don't go to, this is unusual, right? Because we're actually doing it in church. But we know that the participation rate in churches is falling. We know the participation in community groups is falling. We know that participation in sporting groups is falling. And I find that really shocking because that was some of my happiest memories growing up, right? Going to sport, meeting lots of people. When I went to university, being able to drink beer when I was underage because your older playmates would buy you beer. But all that stuff was really great, but a lot of those community things are breaking, right? And so if you don't have media to provide that ability to kind of interact with each other and find that consensus, and you don't trust government, it becomes a spiral unless we do something about it. So I'm trying to paint this fairly gloomy picture because I think that's where we are here. And the reason why I did that was because what I was finding is I'm going around the country telling people, here is a great way to solve your problem. housing, social housing, emergency housing, I don't know, whatever. Take a problem. Beautiful, right? Technically beautiful, lovely report with lots of charts, lots of recommendations. Doesn't go anywhere. Nobody's picking it up. And I'm like, why is nobody paying attention to what we're talking about? And part of that reason was because what we found was people were too far apart and they were unable to hold those ideas together to implement those changes. So I did this piece of work on social cohesion to kind of go, I actually want to know where we are relative to other places, so then we can start having this conversation about New Zealand's social capital, about whether we are actually capable of coming together to make some of those trade-offs, to be able to bear some cost for somebody else's benefit. And the reason why we competed with Australia, because as you know, we like to compete with Australians, right? So whether it's rugby or social cohesion, it's like you gotta have a battle. So MSD has been writing something on social cohesion for a while, but the problem is their bottom line is everything is fine in New Zealand. Nothing to see here. Don't worry. We could make some improvement, but actually it's okay. They literally had a report out earlier this week that said everything is fine in New Zealand. I'm like, are you kidding? That's not what we found when we looked at the data. And so what we found was there are some aspects that are absolutely amazing. So when it comes to our kind of sense of belonging and the idea of New Zealand as a country, amazing. Over 80% of us feel like we really belong in New Zealand. But how many of us think our local community is getting better? A quarter. There is a lack of translation between this big picture of New Zealand as a country and to our local neighborhood and a local community. And what I'm trying to describe here is that there is this layers of connection, and there's some layers of this connection that have been lost over time, and particularly at the local community level, we've really lost it. So we kind of measured things across 5 broad dimensions around a sense of belonging, everything from a sense of belonging in New Zealand to local community to family, sense of worth, social inclusion and justice, participation, and ideas of acceptance and rejection. And so you can see there that, generally speaking, New Zealand tracks behind Australia, so very hard to see, but Australia is the grey bars. We track behind Australia on almost every dimension. The only thing we did better on was turning up to protests. And which is good because that's part of our rights. But part of the reason why they didn't have as good a turnout was because their voice referendum was the year before, when they had been protesting. And we were protesting a lot in this period of the survey because we had the treaty bill that was going through. So the question is really around, are we happy to see this? And the answer is we shouldn't be. And some of the things that I saw that were really quite good, I mentioned the belonging to nation. But what was really surprising was only 2/3 of us say that neighbours would help each other. And I found that really surprising. But it turned out to be a particularly Auckland problem. It turns out we don't like our neighbours that much in Auckland, but in other parts of New Zealand we do. So maybe our fences are too high, I don't know. About 57% of us think courts and elections are fair, which is good compared to an international comparison. But still, 57%, you kind of go, that's not that high. And when you kind of look into the data, what you find is the people who don't think courts and votes are fair, elections are fair, are people who are poor, people who are marginalized. So people whose experiences are that it doesn't matter if I vote, it doesn't matter if I go to court, I'm not going to be looked after. So their experiences are very negative. But the things that really worried me was around things like poverty. So like I said, a quarter of New Zealanders said they skipped a meal because they didn't have enough money. In Australia, it's half that. So we have twice the rate of people going hungry in New Zealand as Australia. The income difference is not a double, right? 1/3 of us would support a strong leader. That's a lot of people. And what was interesting in that was it was one of the few places where rich and poor people agreed. But I don't think what the poor person was thinking about having a strong leader is the same thing that the rich person was thinking about. So their pictures of what that strong leader looked like was different. The other thing that came through was quite a lot of the desire for a strong leader was coming from recent immigrants, particularly from places like China and India. There was a much greater acceptance of a strong leader, much less support for courts, much less trust in institutions. So there's a whole bunch of layers of stuff that's going on that are quite important. And the last one really scared me because immigration is kind of our only trick in the policy bag, right? Whenever there is a recession, let's have more immigrants, right? It doesn't matter if we have houses or infrastructure or nurses or doctors, it doesn't matter. Let's just have more immigrants. And when we don't have, well, it switches, right? We go from, why are there so many immigrants coming to New Zealand? Or why don't we have enough immigrants coming to New Zealand? We're quite schizophrenic. It's one or the other. But I think amongst New Zealanders, it's not so schizophrenic. Half of New Zealanders do not think that immigrants make good citizens. In a country that's literally full of immigrants, half of us don't think immigrants make good citizens. In Australia, it's only 8%. To turn it around, in Australia, over 90% of people think that immigrants make good citizens, whereas in New Zealand, only half of us do. So there is something going on in New Zealand that's quite frightening. I think something has broken, and I think we should pay attention. I don't think we should assume that we are in the same position in terms of social cohesion or in terms of our acceptance, our tolerance, that those things are nearly as good as they were in our history. I worry that we are being very complacent at the moment, thinking that everything is fine when it's not. When we talk about inequality, when we talk about policies, when we talk about the consistency and endurance of policies that will be required to make positive change, how can you do that when we can't agree with each other, when we don't see each other, when we don't connect with each other? I don't think it's going to be easy. And I think it's going to get a little bit harder because when we have an aging population that's going to create a lot of fiscal pressures, I think those things will become not just a policy problem, but it's going to become a money problem. And money problems bring out the worst in people. And essentially the story about aging, this is that slow burning thing that's happening in the background. 50 years ago, we used to have 8 working age people per retiree. Today we have 4. In 50 years' time, we're going to have 2 working age people per retiree. Our entire system of taxes and public services that we have promised to ourselves only work when we have lots of young people. They simply do not work when we run out of those young people. And it doesn't matter how much immigration we have, that curve is still going down. Here's a trick. I don't know if you guys know this. Immigrants also get old. And the reason why that's hard is because if you look at the picture on the right-hand side, that's the net fiscal transfers. So this is all the taxes we pay, less all the services we consume, right? And it's entirely reasonable because young people, of course, we should look after them, invest in their health and education because they're future citizens. And then we get into work and we work a lot. We're in generally good health. We don't need a lot of services. And then we retire. We get access to superannuation, health, and then aged care at the end. So these things are expensive and these things are useful, and that's all fine. I don't have a problem with that. It just needs to be sustainable. It needs to be fair across generations. The problem is our current setup in this way is not going to work if we don't have more than 4 working age people per retiree. As we're already getting into these structural deficits, which are only going to intensify. And I tell you this is because you know from your individual experiences that when money enters this equation, things become even more fraught. And that's going to happen at a national scale in a big way. But also, we're going to get things wrong a lot. So I don't know if you guys know, I'm very unwelcome in Wanganui. Some of you know. I call this Wanganui a zombie town. And you can pretty much see where in that chart I called it a zombie town. It was exactly at this point here. And right after I called it a zombie town, the population of Wanganui went up. So you know, all my overconfident predictions I'm making tonight, you take it with a grain of salt. But part of the reason why I show this is because it's very easy to get caught up in this stuff and think that nothing can change. And my kind of reflection of Wanganui's experiences, actually things can change quite rapidly and you just don't know where it's going to come from. So we need to remain curious and humble and just make sure that we do that. The other kind of example of that, which is tinged with a bit of sadness, is I did a bunch of work about 10 years ago thinking about what the future population of New Zealand would look like, what sort of homes we should build, where we should build, and all that kind of stuff. And we were like, we need to build lots of 1-bedroom and 2-bedroom homes because lots of older people, lots of young people coupling up later. So we're going to need more smaller homes in New Zealand because we don't have many of them. Fastest growing family type over the last decade? Families with adult children living at home. That was not on my bingo card, right? Now, the sad reality is the reason why those poor kids are living at home with their parents is because they can't afford to go and buy their own home. So it's not that they want to live in multi-generational homes, it's they're forced into living into the situation. So quite often what we'll find is we get surprised in different reasons in different ways, but perhaps for different reasons. The reason I tell you this again is because I think we just need to think that things can change really quickly, and it's possible for these things to change, and we need to be open to those opportunities. There's a couple of things that are in the background that are worrying me a little bit at the moment. One is around home ownership in New Zealand, because so much of our comfort and retirement and things are based on the idea of home ownership, and yet we know the home ownership rate is still falling, and we're going to have more and more older people reaching retirement without home ownership. And that means universal super will be completely unsustainable. We need to make super absolutely necessary for that 60% of New Zealanders who will need it, make it more generous, make it absolutely guaranteed. But there'll be a good 40% of New Zealanders who should not need super, and they should look after themselves. That's the only way we're going to be able to make these things fit. But we are currently in this position where we're stuck saying nothing can change. And that's really problematic. And climate change, the Treasury put out their long-term fiscal briefing yesterday, and it was the first time they put climate change in it. That when we think to the future, it's not just aging and all those other risks. Climate change is increasingly becoming a fiscal cost and a fiscal risk. So far, what we've done is gone, every time there is a crisis, we'll just make you whole, right? We'll just make a transfer from the rest of New Zealanders, all the taxpayers, and we'll pick up those people who are affected. The problem is, how many disasters can you fix before the public go, not anymore? Which is what happened in Auckland, right? With the floods, we paid out a ton of money to people whose homes were washed away. How many floods do you think we can afford before the public of Auckland go, sorry, it's your house. Did you share the upside of your capital gains with me? You didn't. So why should I pay for your downside? And this is when those things break. Those social contracts can break really quickly. And the other thing is, of course, around infrastructure where we don't have enough. Now, I'm going on, but when I think about government, and when you think about government, we probably think about government in more of the right-hand side of that matrix. And so, very busy picture. Any of you can have this slides afterwards if you want. But essentially, across the top, if you can see, on the right-hand side are the kind of different actions, different ways that government operate. And a lot of it is around resourcing, delivering, and controlling. So what I mean by that is, having the money for it, having the rules and regulation, all the punishment that goes on with it, right? The implementation of things. That's the sharp end of government. But government also does a whole bunch of other things on the left-hand side, all the way from influencing, engaging, designing. This is about the leadership, the narrative, how we think about us as a country. Because our politicians, once in their position of power, they also have the ability to speak on our behalf. And they can either use that podium to bring us together or to split us apart. And so what we're finding is that quite often we do a lot of thinking of government around the policy side, including the topic I was given today, right? What are the policies that led to the inequality of New Zealand, rather than what is the wider context that allows that we tolerate the inequality in our society. Because, just from a moral perspective, it's abhorrent to see the kind of poverty that we have in New Zealand. But we choose to have policies that maintain the status quo or worsen it. So the reason why I think about this, and this is a very big kind of picture, but is essentially to just remind you that government is more than just the policies and the actions. Government is a lot more. And a huge part of government is actually creating that space for the public to come together, to have conversations, to find shared meaning. But we don't do a lot of that. Most of government has moved towards that right-hand side of it, which is the very act neoliberal kind of thing, versus the much more holistic, democratic, political institution, which is about national conversations, national collective meaning, and national collective conversation. Now, this is very high-level stuff, but I think it's really important we keep this in the back of your mind, because I think this is where many of the failures are. So, when it comes to the topic that I was given in terms of when it comes to things around inequality, the actions and the inactions, because both of these things matter. A lot of poverty and inequality in New Zealand exist not because of deliberate actions, but by deliberate omissions of action. So inaction can be just as powerful as action can be. So when we talk about the policies, it's of course a little bit about what we do. The question is, are the things that we do, are they evidence-based, are they consistent and coherent? And the answer is no. If any of you work in the social services, you'll know that there is one policy over here that's trying to help this group, and there's another policy over here that takes the money away from them when they go from being poor to just a little bit less poor, right? Oh no, you're okay now. You've left emergency housing. Now you're on the path to becoming a homeowner. It's like, come on. This is not how real life works, right? And then there is an element of how we do it. So policy is not just about what we do. Of course, the way that we design policies and we implement it is really important. But whether the process of the policy making takes people with you is really important to ensure if that policy will endure through political cycles. And increasingly what we see is, I'm in power, I will do this thing, and then, well, if it doesn't last, that's not my problem. And that's exactly what we're going to see. So when it comes to infrastructure, for example, that's what we've seen. When Labour came into power, they turned off a whole bunch of projects that were blue. When National came into power, they turned off a lot of projects that were red. And then it's taken them nearly 2 years to start it back up again. And in the meantime, we've lost our engineers and our workers. Do you know where they went? To Australia. Because why wouldn't you? Because they want you, they'll pay you well. Oh, and by the way, you're half as likely to die at work. Kind of nice, eh? So the policies are much more than the specific policies. I think it's a little bit about what, but also about how. There's a whole bunch of policies of action. And what I mean by that is when I think about things like our welfare system, what we have done is gone, if you're poor, you're going to get paid less than the same welfare that we give to old people because they're old, right? The gap between New Zealand Super and welfare, if you're a younger person out of work, is massive. And it's only going to get bigger because New Zealand Super is indexed to wages, which rises at roughly twice the rate of inflation that unemployment benefits are indexed at. So it's by design that we have entrenched. One, you're going to be poorer if you lose your job as a young person. And you're going to become more poor over time because of just the passage of time. What an extraordinary act of cruelty. But it's deliberate, deliberately baked into what we do. When it comes to education, many of you will have benefited from our lovely education system. I was in the period when we had to pay interest on our student loans. And things have only gotten harder for future generations, current generations, right? And a lot of the things that benefited our previous generations, we've done a really good job of pulling up the ladder behind us. Not you individually, but in a collective way in the policies that we have implemented. Very actively, we have pulled up the ladder saying, I got the benefit of free education, but not for you. You don't need it. You should pay for it. And you should pay it back with a lot of interest. So there are some really big issues in terms of these policies of action that have embedded these barriers. So the high cost of education essentially means that we know, we can see it in the data, the rates of participation of tertiary education amongst people in the lower deciles of income is very low. And it's not increasing as much as it should, right? Because we know that there can be a real ticket in terms of jobs, careers, incomes over lifetimes. Of inaction. We're doing the same when it comes to climate change. We're doing the same when it comes to child poverty. These are not difficult things to deal with. You just have to get started, right? Especially with things like child poverty. It is so solvable in New Zealand. All it requires is literally cash grants, right? We would actually be able to solve it really easily if we wanted to, but we choose not to. So there is something very sick in society when we say that I blame that child for being born poor. Right? We know that the biggest reason why we have inequality in most societies, the most important contributing factor, is your parents. We can't choose them, right? So why and how can we kind of think about this stuff? So I was doing some work with the good people in Tuhoi a few years ago, but 22, I think, 21, 22. And I don't know if any of you have been to Taniatua? Yeah? Beautiful place. But also I'm the wrong kind of brown. And you're in this room and trying to be this confident economist talking about how everything works. And then Tamati, who's a very smart guy, he goes, I don't think so, Shamubeel. So this was one of the things he told me I don't think so about. And so he told me about how do you create good policy. And I said, well, it's pretty simple. It's gates and ladders. Stop doing the bad stuff and do more of the good stuff. And he's like, yeah, that's really obvious. But what you're missing is the bit that's in the middle. if you actually want to create policies that stick and create good positive outcomes, you also have to do the unity bit, which is in the box, which is about making sure that we are working together, the coordination part, and the things that we do work together, that cohesion part. And so that's, to me, that was a really powerful kind of reminder that it's very easy to talk about things in terms of the nuts and bolts. So if I just had that one policy, if I just stopped doing that one thing, everything would be better. But the lesson for me was actually, you can have the best possible ideas, like all those reports that I've written for people, but they're not resonating with anybody because you haven't been able to take people with you. But it's not my job as an economist to take people with me, right? My job is to be a nerd and think of solutions to technical problems. And yet, who's going to do that? And that's a really difficult one. And so I just want to kind of touch on this Tuhoe example just a little bit, only because I think it helps us kind of put a different frame on it. And I think, personally, that the Tikanga worldview or the indigenous worldview is very similar to a Christian worldview, to a much more religious worldview, because at its core is making sure everything is turned the right way up. And let me explain what I mean by that. So when I was talking about, so this project I was doing, it was a bizarre project. So just to give you a little bit of introduction to the project, I was invited by MB. MB never invites anybody. They invited me to Tanya Tour because they were finding it really difficult to get any agreement on anything with the project that they were working on with Tuhoe. And every time they started to work on something, they were finding this incredible amounts of friction. So I came in to go, okay, so the big project that we're working on is economic development. Let's put a Tikanga lens on it to go, how are we describing things and where are we going wrong? So that's what we tried to do. So in the kind of conventional orthodox view, this is my Wellington kind of hat, right, on the left-hand side, and the right-hand side is the Tuhoe Tikanga view. And so the whole idea is that what I was taught is you create economic prosperity through property rights, ownership of assets. In Tikanga, it's about stewardship of resources. The language is very different. It has a huge amount of connotation. The driving force of what actually takes priority in terms of being able to make most of those assets is rights. That's what I was taught at university. Those property rights are extremely important. That's what gives you the security to know that this property is yours, you can utilize it and maximize it, and you get the best outcome. And the Tuhoe view and the Tikanga view is, yes, of course, you have rights, but first comes the responsibilities. So those resources come with a whole bunch of responsibilities first, which then gives you the right to be able to use that as a steward. Who benefits from this property, this resource, this economic activity? Very individual, right? So in economics, it's very much the sum total of individuals equals the wider economy. Society is the sum of the parts. And in the indigenous worldview, it's the other way around. The individual succeeds when the community flourishes. The community comes first, then the individual. So it turns it around. We kind of measure things more in the day-to-day running of things. And so one of the analogies that we used in Tanya Tour was the river. And so when we're in Wellington, we're standing by the river bend and we're watching and measuring the river as it goes past us. And for Tuhoe, it's where did the river come from and where is it going? It's the whole river that matters. You can't just look at this bit of the river and make sense of it. You have to think about all of it. And the final one that also mattered was when we make public policy decisions in New Zealand and pretty much every part of the world, we discount the future. And what I mean by that, if there is a benefit that accrues to a future generation, well, I'm going to be dead. Why should I pay for it? We literally, and I'm not joking you, we literally sit there and go, because this investment is not going to benefit me, I will not make this investment. Which is an extraordinary thing to say, right? Extraordinary. And so I took my kids up to Waitakere to see the dam. And have any of you seen that? Yeah? And some of those pictures are incredible, right? They built it with like horse and cart. Like incredible. But the design of that, the size of the dam was that high because they built it for Auckland 100 years forward. They were never going to benefit from the dam that they built. That wasn't the intent. The intent was it was built for future generations. And I think therein lies a really big, important thing. Because we discount the future, we are making very short-term decisions by definition. Whereas in tikanga, it's explicitly valuing the future. And so if I think about a telescope looking out to the future, when we're making decisions in Wellington today, we are standing at the present looking to the future and asking, what does it mean to me? And for the tikanga view is to go, I'm standing in the future looking back, asking, what should my grandparents have done for me? And those are very different decisions, very different trade-offs that we would have to make. So I've taken you to a lot of different places, but this is one of my favorite pictures. On the left-hand side is the picture of economic success for the bureaucrats in Wellington. And on the right-hand side is the picture of economic success for the people of Tauniatua. They're both beautiful mountains, right? But they're entirely different mountains. The reason why when the bureaucrats turned up into Tauniatua and said, we want to make your economy more prosperous, they were talking about that. And when the people of Tauniatua saw the policies they were coming up with, it's like, we're not going to achieve that with the things that you're offering us. It just does not make sense. And because they were not talking to each other, they were not able to bring those worldviews together. So they were constantly at odds. And the only reason I got paid for this job was essentially for this picture. This was the only thing that added value, was essentially to tell them the reason why you guys are not getting on is because you haven't articulated your visions of the future and your values. And because you haven't spoken honestly and openly about what you're thinking about, those worldviews haven't come together. Now, I don't think we have to all be the same. We don't all have to have the same mountain. But we do have to understand that some of us will have very different views. And only when we can bring those mountains closer together, we'll be able to make some of those policy choices that might be different. So there's a few things that I think that really matter here, which is around when we're thinking about things like inequality, when we're thinking about poverty, and when we're thinking about public policy, I find we spend too much time going down the detail of which specific policy led to these bad outcomes, rather than taking a step back and going, why was it that we made those decisions? And why is it that we haven't been able to change? Because I think therein lies the issue. It's not so much that we're missing the ability to create public policy ideas. It's not that we don't have the ability to create changes. I think what we're missing is the permission and the demand from the community. And there is a much bigger failure of society and democracy that's leading to the inequalities and public policies that we see today. So I'm going to give you a few suggestions in terms of how communities like yours can play a really important and vital role. Because I think we're all finding that we want to find actions that we can take in the ways that we operate and what we do. So these are very high-level ideas, but take it as you will. I think when you're doing your big kind of strategy and thinking about what you want to be, there's three broad things I'd love you to think about. The first is around the whole purpose of having organizations like this and gatherings like this is to provide meaning. It's a shared experience that provides a collective meaning. The second thing is around we want people to be able to not just have that shared experience, but also to find those who are interested to be able to come together and to coordinate and work together in some way, if you want, if you have the energy, if you have this resource. And finally, there has to be something about some kind of collective action, because it's all well and good for us to have the best of intent, but we can't be silent and we can't be absent. So much of the issues that we see in society is through absence, through inaction, and we have to create some purpose that we can do that. I think organizations, particularly churches, do have to find the resources to have that administrative capacity to be able to do this. I think it's a really big stress that I'm seeing on community organizations around the country, that their administrative capacity is being hollowed out, which makes it really hard to hold that place to be able to be all of those things. I think we need to make sure that we are leaning into evidence, because all I'm seeing around the world at the moment is anti-evidence. People just making stuff up, particularly the president of the US. And I think a lot of it's about how do we kind of engage with people around the community. And finally, I think we just need to be really alive to the political realities of today, because the politics are shifting really quickly. And I think the environment could move very quickly for all of us. So I've taken you on a very long-winded, meandering conversation, and partly because I don't know the answer. The question you posed was too hard. But I think we can agree that what we did isn't working. The reason why we haven't changed, I think, is because there is a failure of imagination, but also there is a failure of understanding. I think we misunderstand what the economy is and what it's for. I think there is a lot of short-termism and that focus on unicorns because that's politically convenient, but I don't think it's a long-running strategy. They'll be found out very quickly. I really truly believe that better is possible. In a country of 5 and a bit million people, we practically know everybody. It's extraordinary that we're not able to be much more collective in the way we do things. But I think the biggest fly in the ointment at the moment is that to make something better, we do have to pay it forward. It has to be for future generations because in some ways, I think it's a bit too late for the current generation of young people. I think we almost have to skip a generation and go, what can we do for the next one? And commit. Those 3 things that I talked about is anything that we do in these kinds of gatherings, keep these ideas in your head, whether they resonate or not, I don't know. But fundamentally what we're trying to do is give people a sense of meaning. I think that's the thing that we have lost the most is because we don't participate, we don't see the importance. Because we don't see the importance, we don't participate, it turns into a spiral. We need to give people meaning to engage with each other. We need to give people a means to come together and to coordinate. But finally, it's not enough for us to simply come together. I think the thing that we have to do is somehow find action that's relevant to each of us, whatever that might look like. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, there'll be a test and see how much you've remembered. No, just kidding. There's a heck of a lot up there, and indeed we've got the recording and we'll have the slides online so you can, at your leisure go through. That's hugely comprehensive, Shamubeel. But look, we've got the opportunity now for some questions.
Yep.
And I'm sure some of you have been bursting. Jenfrey. Yeah.
I knew you'd be first. We go way back, so it's fine.
Well, I was one of the lucky ones in the 60s to go to university without charge or fully subsidised. And I'm interested, Shamubeel, that coincided with a very high level or low level of inequality. But my parents paid a marginal tax rate of 66%. And I noticed that you haven't mentioned taxes and capital gains or wealth taxes, and I'm wondering if you've got some comment about that.
Well, Jenfrey, that's how we paid for it. We had, they don't exist out of nothing. And so that generation, particularly that post-war generation, was willing to pay. They were willing to pay and they were willing to invest. They didn't see it as a cost. They saw it as an investment in their children and their society. And therein lies the problem is when it's I alone, your taxes are an impost. And I was on TV once and I said tax is love. And the very next day, the New Zealand Initiative put out a blog post saying tax is rapacious. Yeah. And the reason why I said tax is love is because tax is the way we collectivize. When we have told government to be the collective agent, that's how we do it. We give them the money so they can do it for all the, that distribution part. Otherwise, it's better off we just do it ourselves. We can do it in our own community without government. We don't need them. We can bypass government, but it's still taxes in a way. It's just done in a slightly different way. But no, absolutely. Look, I have no problems with taxes, but I guess to present it as a solution when we don't want to look after others who are not like us doesn't fly. Nobody wants to pay more taxes to look after the poor when you think the poor are there because of their own agency, right? Which is, I honestly find that so much these days. People truly think that you are poor because you are lazy. So I don't know. I don't think it's a surprise that during those periods we had extremely high tax rates. That is how we paid for the services that I think built up our nation. So much of our foundation was built in the post-Second War era. So much of my economic history, I mean, I talk to Brian Easton a lot. I don't know if any of you read Brian Easton, but Brian's like the grumpiest and the most amazing economist I've ever met in my life. And because he's also a historian, he's always got that kind of historical narrative of what do we do? And a lot of it was around those shared collective investments that were made, including through taxes. Sir, I'll come back to you.
So thanks very much for the analysis. It's been really good. And in particular, the Tikanga view, I've really taken that on board. Thank you. My question for you is about electoral systems.
Sure.
Now, that's one of the big changes we've seen in over our lifetimes.
With MMP, you mean? With MMP?
MMP.
Yep.
I'm just wondering, from your point of view, what's your view of the situation we've landed in?
Really good question. So when it comes to the electoral system with MMP, we do get slightly strange outcomes in terms of, I guess, the relative strength of minor parties in government. But then I look at the US and the UK, and they don't have that. They have first past the post, and they can screw it up just as well. So I'm not sure that the electoral system is the reason why we're getting these outcomes. It's maybe that we get it taking shape in slightly different ways, if that makes sense. So I think my analysis would be that more of the reason is the discontent in society that's spilling over into politics. It will either do so through those major parties, if that is the case, or it will do through MMP, which might come a bit sooner. But I look at the rise of Farage in the UK, I mean, pretty much the biggest party in the UK now. So in first past the post, there might be the government. And he's crazy. You know, the policies they're talking about are not good policies. These are not sensible, balanced policies. So people might do that anti-vote, sure, but the actual quality of the public policies talking about are hugely damaging. So I really worry that I think when we think about electoral systems, it might be a little bit of a distraction from the underlying cause, but I suspect with MMP, we've actually navigated this phase better than other places. I look at what's happened in places like Germany and other places which have similar but more unwieldy MMP systems. They provide checks and balances, but not enough. No system can survive when the public actually wants something very different.
So my wife and I just retired here 2 years ago, so before that we were 30 years away, so I haven't lived through all this.
Yeah.
But my question to you is, there was somebody that was going to address inequality and child poverty called Jacinda, and what happened to Saint Jacinda and Jacinda Mania, and then 2 years later or whatever it was, she was resigning, and
Sure.
maybe your verdict on her time?
My verdict on her was she was an amazing leader with a very weak team that could not execute. And now we have a very weak leader who can't lead but can execute some things. So we seem to have one or the other, you know, either lots of charisma and potential and the ability to kind of unite a country, but the ability to kind of execute policies. But also it was a very weird time through COVID.
Sure.
And you know, that took the priority in terms of the crisis. But in terms of child poverty, they were actually starting to make some progress. But the problem was because they didn't take the other side of the aisle with them, as soon as they got into power, those policies were out the window. And this chop change makes it very difficult because it's the poor children that get shunted from one thing to the other. So very frustrating situation. And again, it's that lack of coordination that gives us the inability to have enduring positive change. Karen, nice to see you.
Do you think is there a country in the world you think is doing a reasonably good job? Because the whole world is in
On fire.
crisis.
Yeah. It's a dumpster fire out there, right? It's happening everywhere. It's something in the air. And I think,
Some doing it better than the others.
no, look, I mean, it's all relative. Everybody has their issues. The question is, are you able to navigate the issues? And like everybody points to the Nordic countries as a place that does it really well, but they have the same kind of rise of far right as they do in other parts of Europe. So that intolerance is building up even in relatively equal societies that we hadn't seen before. So no, I wouldn't say there is a country that you could point a finger and say, we should just go do that. I think there is an element of, do we have the social capital to be able to navigate these periods of wrenching change? I think that's what we're seeing. We are doing okay in New Zealand. We're navigating this relatively well. So I don't think that we should give up hope that nothing is good, but I don't think it's enough. I think we've been managing through these periods of change with apathy and inaction. And I think we need to switch to action. So I'd love to be inspired by the Nordic countries, but I just don't think we have the levels of social cohesion that they started with to implement the kinds of policies and political processes that they had. Very consultative, very grassroots. I can't see it. So, slightly discouraging answer, sorry.
What concerns me is when a political party, for example, the Green Party, put out a plan for finance.
Yes.
And when I read it, I thought, yes, there are aspects of that that could work well and could work well for the poorer
Sure.
people. However, my wondering is, when they came up with that, immediately the economists said the most, they said it was rubbish, and the paper was full of these derogatory remarks.
Yes.
And I thought, well, they're economists, they must know what's
Nah, never trust an economist. Honestly, you can't trust economists. We dress up economics as if it's a science. It is not. But also, I think this has been one of the things is we went from that more social aspect of doing politics to doing a more economics aspect of doing politics. And that's quite damaging because economics is only one part, and I think a very narrow part. So I read the Greens fiscal plan. I thought it was fine. They put all the costs at the back, which pissed everybody off because everybody wanted to say, how much will I have to pay? And the reality was that their numbers added up. It just cost a lot of money. And the question is, are people willing to bear the cost for somebody else? And that somebody else part is the biggest part. Is fundamentally what we're talking about is, are we willing to tip more in, like Jan Free's parents did? Are we willing to do that for more of New Zealanders to have those nice things? And the answer is, at the moment, we don't want to. We actually don't want to pay more taxes. And so if you don't want to pay more taxes, either you have to have fewer public services or you have to have worse public services. There are no other ways of doing it. There is no unicorn. Sir?
Comment
Sure.
on what you're saying. It seems to me that ideology is very important.
Yes.
Talk about people who don't want to pay taxes. There's the sovereignty movement where people
Sovereign citizen movement, yes.
reject any idea of anything being sovereign above themselves, justice or whatever. And so it seems to me that the effect or the implication from the 1980s neoliberal policies, but the actual application of ideologies and that application on like the lives of multiple generations of people. So there are lots of kids now who have never been a member of a union who wouldn't really have any idea that it might be useful to their personal circumstance to be a member of a union. And so this is something that I sort of grapple with, is that this is a very long game.
Of course.
To wear out a wrong ideology, if I could be as blunt as that.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I guess that's kind of what I was trying to describe today is part of the reason why we're here today is because we don't value those social contracts. We don't value those relationships. And that's why we don't have those relationships. But now that we've become fragmented and isolated, those little islands in our own country, we find it difficult to come together to solve those big issues that we want to solve. Because the problems that we face collectively are much the same, right? I mean, those big issues affect all of us one way or the other. But now we've lost the ability to come together. That ability to kind of collectivize is very difficult. So I don't think you need to necessarily do with a union. I think unions are very useful because we find it in so many different settings, from everything from pay to working conditions to all the kind of the rights that we have in work, full stop, came from the union movement. But the history has been lost. And if you talk to most people in New Zealand today, they see unions with a very negative lens, that they're bad people who hold things up, rather than people who got you all the rights that you enjoy. So there's a bizarre situation. And I think partly it's that kind of, as I was trying to describe to you, something like our collective narrative has shifted. And it's become very unmoored from our true history. And it's the lack of understanding and lack of imagination. Both of those things really matter. So we are unable to imagine different ways of doing things, and we don't understand why we have many of the good things that we have, or how to change it. So I think we are a bit stuck, but you need a moment of crisis, right? There's almost this cathartic effect that happens when you have crisis. I was hoping that we would have it with COVID. It turned out we didn't. We just kind of pushed through, and then came out the other side and went, okay, just go on. And so it was a little bit difficult to see that from the sidelines, because I really thought that there would be a moment of coming together, because we did do some great things together as a country. I mean, our mortality rate through the COVID period was extraordinarily good. But did we get it all right? Probably not.
It's interesting you should say that, because for me, that period, I felt New Zealand tore apart. I thought the society became more divisive.
It came together right at the beginning. The first lockdown was the most kumbaya time that I think I've ever seen.
Yeah.
And then pretty much after that, it just went.
Yeah. And so for me, we've never recovered from that.
No, but I don't think that was the only cause. Do you know what I mean? These pressures. Oh, absolutely. I mean, so I used to be on the Audit and Risk Committee at police. So when the front line were going over to deal with the protest in Parliament, my God, these were kids. These were kids we sent into a situation that was like war. It was really frightening. And when you saw that, it was kind of like, wow, I didn't think that was possible in New Zealand, right? And so, like you, when I saw that, it was like, wow, something has changed in New Zealand, and something had been bubbling for a long time that's now found expression. So again, to me, it's kind of like, that was my 90s to kind of to today's story. That polarization had been building for a long time, and then something happened through that period that gave vent, and we're here today.
Do you think, or what role do you think social media has in that 50
Yeah.
years ago you wrote letters to people?
It slowed things down a bit, didn't they?
And so now everyone's got an opinion, and it doesn't even have to be polite or respectful.
It's usually not polite.
So what role do you think social media has played?
Yeah, really great question. And the answer is, it has been one of those big amplifiers of the worst traits and the best traits of society. It amplifies the edges. And so most of the analysis shows that about 20% of people are super active on social media, and 80% of us are not. Because I don't know about you, I don't have time in my life. It's like, so what you see in social media is actually the most extreme proponents of society in their little fragments, and they're really, really loud. And it amplifies those feelings and views. So it has absolutely done that. So we don't know for sure in New Zealand, but the data from Australia shows that those who engage more in social media are more likely to be extreme in their views, whatever it might be. Just they feel everything very strongly, and they're more likely to be lonely and disconnected from each other and their community. So it's a very isolating thing. So there's a great philosopher called Byung-Chul Han, and his kind of prescription and definition of social media is, it's like the fast food of social connection. There is no connection, and essentially because you're getting such terrible connection, it actually makes you less happy, less connected, and less content.
So while I see social media as being an individual activity almost,
It is, but people think it's collective.
so where does media sit in bringing us?
Well, it doesn't, because nobody trusts media anymore. And as I showed you, only a third of us trust media. So media's role had been for a long time to provide that objective kind of place where you could go and find information, which you could then take away and then kind of digest. But the speed is such now that all we hear is the headlines without any analysis, right? It's just bombarded with headlines. And like quite often I'll get a phone call from the journo and going, oh, the data came out 30 seconds ago, what do you think? Well, I don't know. I haven't looked at it. Like, you do realize this data set probably has a spreadsheet that's this big with that many different dimensions. How do you think I'm going to know that in 30 seconds? Well, no, I need a comment now because, that's it. And then once I've written the story, that's it. There's no chance to go back and talk about it again. You get one chance only. So It's not clear to me that media is particularly helpful in this environment either, because media has become caught up in the same hype cycle as social media. So I think I feel quite stuck. I don't know what the answer is, but I do feel like there is a reason why people don't trust media, and they're running faster and faster because their commercial structures just don't work anymore. They're losing money, and they're chasing that audience really hard. We don't want to read long form stuff. I mean, I do, but there's not enough of us around.
Shamubeel,
Last question, thanks.
oh, does somebody else want one? I have two.
You go for it.
I'm just wondering about whether you think citizens' assemblies are effective or,
Yeah.
and are they realistic?
I love citizens' assemblies because I'm a nerd. Whether they're realistic, probably not for everything, but I think they could be used strategically to provide that opportunity for people to come together and see that on those big issues, when we work together, we can actually do it. So on this social cohesion work that I'm doing, that's the finale that I want to make. So I've got funding for 5 years, so I've got 4 more years of this. On the 5th year, I want to do a big deliberative democracy experiment on one topic and just see if we can bring a big collection of people together and just get them to provide a recommendation that they can live by. And I think we can. Most of the international experiences, deliberative democracy processes can be very successful in creating a good enough solution. And that's all we're looking for, right? And that can be progressed on over time. But because you've got the foundation of positive consensus-built environment where everybody's had a chance to be heard, everybody's kind of views have been incorporated in some way or the other, and where it's been rejected, it's been provided enough information to people yeah, I feel appeased that you kind of took my view on board. It couldn't be taken in, couldn't be implemented for these reasons, and what we have ended up with is good enough. And good enough is enough. It doesn't have to be perfect. So look, thank you for the question, Jennifer. I'm a big fan of it. I don't think we can do it for every policy, but I think if we do it for some of the big policies, we will find that New Zealanders have more in common than we think, but at the moment we can't see what we have in common.